11 wild horses stand motionless outside St. Matthew's Church every Sunday morning, their breath visible in the Kentucky dawn, eyes fixed on the weathered wooden doors as hymns echo from within. Nobody leads them there. Nobody calls them home yet. For 2 years they've appeared like clockwork, standing sentinel through rain, snow, and scorching heat, only to vanish into the hills when the final amen is spoken. The people of Meadow Creek whisper about miracles and signs from above. But elderly caretaker Thomas Whitaker has seen the tears streaming down Grace Sullivan's face when she watches them from the back pew. Tears that hold the key to a devastating truth buried beneath 2 years of silence. What brings these majestic creatures to worship? Why? Does Mayor Collins want them removed at any cost? And what terrible secret connects these horses to the worst tragedy in Meadow Creek's history? A secret so powerful that when finally revealed, it will leave an entire community shaken to its core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Whitaker's weathered hands tremble slightly as he unlocks the doors of St. Matthew's Church at 73. He feels the morning chill in his bones more than he used to. The rising sun casts long shadows across the church grounds, painting the white clapper walls with a golden glow. Thomas pauses on the steps, his gaze drawn to the eastern hills where the first light breaks over Crescent Valley. They'll be are coming soon. He whispers to himself. For most of his life, Thomas had been the kind of man who believed only in what he could touch, what he could see. Practical, dependable, the perfect church caretaker for 40 years. But that was before the horses, before everything changed inside. Thomas moves with practiced efficiency, preparing the sanctuary for Sunday service. He straightens, hymn knells, adjusts the altar cloth, and checks that the heating system is working properly through the stained glass windows. He watches the horizon. Reverend Samuel Hayes enters, his footsteps echoing in the empty church morning. Thomas, cold one today morning. Reverend, won't be long now. The minister nods, understanding the unspoken meaning. Have you spoken with Mayor Collins? Thomas's expression darkens. He called again yesterday, or he says the town council's meeting on Tuesday, to discuss the horse situation. His voice takes on a mocking tone at the final words. I've tried reasoning with Richard, but he's convinced they're a public safety hazard, ever since that incident with the Harrison boy that wasn't the horse's fault. Thomas interrupts. That boy had no business climbing on the church roof to get a better view. The horses never moved, never spooked. Not once. Samuel places a reassuring hand on the old caretaker's shoulder. I know, Thomas, but Mayor Collins needs someone to blame, and the horses make an easy target. The conversation is interrupted by the church door opening. Helen Parker, the church organist for 30 years, hurries in breathless. They're coming, she announces. Everyone's already gathering outside. Thomas moves to the window, his heart quickening as it does every Sunday morning. In the distance, emerging from the morning mist, 11 silhouettes appear along the ridge. First, the massive black stallion they called Thunder, his white star visible even from a distance. Then the others, Esperanza, Spirit, Daisy, Ranger, Willow Storm, Whisper, Duke, Autumn, and Midnight, each one falling into formation behind their leader. Right on time, Thomas murmurs, checking his watch. 7:35. Exactly like always, outside a small crowd has gathered. Some are church members, others tourists who've heard about Meadow Creek's miracle horses. Cameras flash as the horses approach at a measured pace, their movements almost ceremonial. Thomas watches the faces in the crowd, some filled with wonder, others with skepticism. His gaze falls on Sheriff Jim Cooper, arms crossed, expression guarded. Next to him stands Mayor Collins, his mouth set in a tight line, clearly displeased. By the gathering spectacle, the horses reach the churchyard and arrange themselves in a perfect semicircle, facing the entrance. Thunder, the lead stallion, stands directly before the steps, his dark eyes seeming to look through the doors into the sanctuary itself. None of them make a sound. None of them graze or fidget. They simply stand as still as statues, waiting. It's not natural. Thomas overhears Mayor Collins telling Sheriff Cooper, "Wild horses don't behave this way. Something's wrong with them, and it's only a matter of time before someone gets hurt. They've never bothered anyone, Richard." The sheriff replies, 2 years they've been coming, and not one incident caused by them. The Harrison boy fell because he was somewhere he shouldn't have been, you know that. The mayor scowls and checks his watch. Town council meets Tuesday. Will put an end to this then as church members begin filing in for the service. Thomas spots a familiar figure moving slowly up the path. Grace Sullivan, 82 years old, leans heavily on her grandson Johnny's arm. Her white hair shines in the morning light, her face lined with years of joy and sorrow. Mostly sorrow these past 2 years as she passes the horses. Grace pauses. Thunder turns his massive head toward her, and for a moment there's a silent exchange between woman and horse. Grace's hand trembles as she reaches out, not quite touching the stallion. Tears begin to flow down her weathered cheeks. Johnny gently urges his grandmother forward. "Come on, Gran, let's get you inside where it's warm." Thomas opens the door for them. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan." "Morning, Johnny." Grace doesn't respond. She hasn't spoken a word since her husband Harold's funeral 2 years ago, but Johnny nods in greeting. "How's she doing?" Thomas asks quietly as Grace makes her way to her usual seat in the back. Johnny shakes his head. "Same. Doctor says there's nothing physically wrong with her. She just doesn't want to talk anymore." He glances back at the horses. "She still won't tell me why she insists on coming every Sunday. When it upsets her so much." Thomas follows his gaze. "Maybe it's not about being upset. Maybe it's about remembering what." Before Thomas can answer, Reverend Hayes calls for everyone to take their seats. The service is about to begin inside. As the first hymn rises, Thomas stands at the back watching. Through the open doors he can see the horses haven't moved. They never do. Not until the final prayer. He looks toward Grace Sullivan. Her eyes closed, tears still flowing. Thomas remembers Harold Sullivan vividly, the strongest man in Meadow Creek, owner of the largest ranch in the county, and the only person Thomas had ever seen who could command 11 horses with nothing more than a whisper. Halfway through the service, Thomas slips outside, walking slowly past the horses. Not one of them acknowledges him, their eyes fixed on the church entrance, all except Thunder, who turns his head slightly to watch Thomas pass. "What are you trying to tell us?" Thomas whispers. "What did Harold ask of you?" The horse gives no response, but Thomas feels a connection, a shared understanding of loss of duty since Martha died 3 years ago. Thomas has felt adrift in the world. The horses give him purpose, a mystery to solve. He's convinced their presence is more than coincidence, more than animal instinct. After the service, people file out, some stopping to marvel at the horses, others hurrying past with uncomfortable glances. Mayor Collins makes a point of walking directly through the middle of their formation. The horses part for him, then resume their positions. Thomas notices Elena Montgomery Ellie to everyone in town watching from the sidelines. As the local veterinarian, she's taken a professional interest in the horses, often documenting their behavior from a distance. "Any new theories?" Thomas asks, approaching her. Ellie shakes her head, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "Nothing that makes scientific sense. Wild horses don't form these kinds of patterns without training, and they certainly don't show up at the same location." At the same time, every week she checks her notebook, 7:35 on the dot again, and they'll leave at exactly 10:23. Right after the final prayer, Thomas adds, like clockwork. Ellie looks troubled. "Mayor Collins asked me to attend the town council meeting on Tuesday. I think he wants my professional opinion to support removing them." "And what is your professional opinion?" She sigh, "That I have no explanation for their behavior, but they're healthy and pose no immediate threat." She pauses. "My personal opinion is that there's something beautiful happening here, something we shouldn't interfere with." Thomas smiles gratefully. "Will you say that at the meeting? I'll try." But Richard's determined. He's already contacted Frank Miller about rounding them up. The thought sends a chill through Thomas. Frank Miller's methods of horse breaking are notoriously harsh. These creatures deserve better. As the crowd thins, Thomas notices Grace Sullivan still sitting in her car, staring at the horses. Johnny stands beside the vehicle, speaking with Michael Reynolds, the local history teacher. Thomas approaches them. "Johnny, I was wondering if I might have a word with your grandmother sometime." Johnny looks surprised. What about the horses, about your grandfather?" Thomas hesitates. "I think she knows why they're here." Michael Reynolds adjusts his glasses. "Actually, I've been researching something that might be connected. The 20-year anniversary of the Crescent Valley flood is coming up next month." The flood, Thomas remembers it well. The worst natural disaster in Meadow Creek's history. 12 people lost, countless homes destroyed. Harold Sullivan played a major role during the rescue efforts. Michael continues, he used his horses to reach people stranded in remote areas. Johnny frowns, what does that have to do with these horses coming to church? Maybe nothing. Michael admits, but the timing seems significant. The horses started appearing exactly 2 years ago, right after Harold's funeral. Thomas finishes the pieces starting to connect in his mind inside the car. Grace Sullivan watches the horses with tear-filled eyes as if sensing their being discussed. Thunder turns his massive head toward them for a fleeting moment. Thomas could swear the horse's gaze meets Grace's. The church bells chime, marking 10:23. As if responding to an unheard command, Thunder raises his head and lets out a soft neigh. The horses turn in perfect unison and begin walking away, their departure as measured and deliberate as their arrival. Thomas watches them disappear over the eastern ridge back into the wilderness of Crescent Valley. See you next Sunday, he whispers later that afternoon. Thomas sits on his porch, a faded photograph in his trembling hands. It shows a younger Harold Sullivan astride a magnificent black stallion, Thunder's sire perhaps behind him. A line of horses stands at attention. Their resemblance to the Sunday visitors unmistakable. The sound of a car draws his attention. Sheriff Cooper's patrol vehicle pulls up the gravel driveway. Ernest Jim says, removing his hat as he approaches the porch, "Thought you should know, Mayor. Collins has called an emergency town council meeting for tomorrow instead of Tuesday. Says he doesn't want to wait." Thomas feels his heart sink. Why the rush he's got? Frank Miller ready to round up those horses as soon as he gets approval claims. They're unbranded, unclaimed livestock on public roads. They're wild horses, Jim. They belong to themselves. The sheriff sighs, I know that. You know that. But legally, Richard has a case. He hesitates. There's something else Diane Peterson's been gathering. Signatures says the horses are disrupting church services, creating traffic hazards. That's nonsense. It's politics. Thomas Richards up for re-election, and Diane's his biggest supporter. Jim puts his hat back on. Meetings at 7 tomorrow night. Thought you'd want to be there after the sheriff leaves. Thomas returns to the photograph. Something about Harold Sullivan's expression haunts him. A mixture of pride and something deeper. Something like reverence for the animals under his care. The phone rings inside, startling Thomas from his thoughts. It's Ellie Montgomery. Thomas, I've been going through some old veterinary records, she says without preamble. I think I've identified at least 3 of the Sunday horses. They were born on Sullivan Ranch, part of Harold's private stock, so they were his horses, yes. But here's the strange part. According to these records, the oldest would be almost 30. Now that's ancient for a horse, especially one living wild. Thomas feels a chill that has nothing to do with the autumn air. What are you saying? I'm saying either my identification is wrong, or she pauses, or these are descendants of Harold's horses, 2nd or 3rd generation, carrying on some behavior they've inherited or learned after hanging up. Thomas makes a decision. Taking his old truck keys from the hook by the door, he sets out toward the most remote property in Meadow Creek, Sullivan Ranch, where Grace Sullivan still lives alone in the sprawling farmhouse Harold built 60 years ago. As Thomas drives, the setting sun casts long shadows across the Kentucky landscape. Tomorrow, the town council will vote on the fate of 11 horses that have captured his heart and imagination. Unless he can uncover the truth behind their mysterious pilgrimages, these magnificent creatures might disappear forever. And something tells him that Grace Sullivan, the silent widow who weeps every Sunday, holds the key to it. All telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The sun dips behind the hills as Thomas's truck rattles down the winding dirt road leading to Sullivan Ranch. Tall grass has reclaimed parts of the driveway, a testament to Harold Sullivan's 2-year absence. Thomas passes faded fence posts that once corralled some of the finest horses in Kentucky. The grand farmhouse stands against the darkening sky, its white paint peeling porch swing moving gently in the evening breeze. A single light glows from the kitchen window. Thomas kills the engine and sits for a moment, gathering his courage. He hasn't been here since Harold's funeral. As he approaches the door, memories flood back. Summer barbecues with Martha, Harold's booming laugh, Grace's homemade apple pie before he can knock the door cacks open, revealing Johnny Sullivan's surprised face. Mr. Whitaker. What brings you all the way out here? I need to speak with your grandmother. It's about the horses. Johnny's expression hardens. She's having a difficult evening, maybe tomorrow would be better from inside. A soft thud draws their attention. Grace Sullivan stands in the hallway, her nightgown covered by a faded blue robe, her white hair loose around her shoulders. She looks smaller than Thomas remembers frailer, yet her eyes burn with an intensity that startles him. "It's all right," Thomas says, gently. "I can come back." But Grace shakes her head and gestures toward the kitchen. Johnny sigh. "I guess that means come in." He leads Thomas through the hallway, lined with Sullivan family photographs. "She might not speak to you. She hasn't said a word to anyone since Grandpa died." The kitchen is warm, a kettle whistling on the old stove. Grace moves with practiced efficiency, preparing 3 cups of tea. Her hands, though wrinkled with age, remain steady. She places cookies on a plate. Harold's favorites Thomas recognizes and sets everything on the table before taking a seat. Grand Johnny says softly, "Mr. Whitaker wants to ask about the horses, the ones that come to church." Grace's expression remains unchanged, but Thomas notices her fingers tighten around her teacup. "Mrs. Sullivan, Grace, Thomas begins the town council's meeting tomorrow to decide whether to remove those horses. Frank Miller's been hired to round them up." He pauses, watching for a reaction. "I believe you know why they come. Every Sunday I think Harold had something to do with it." Grace stares into her tea, motionless. "Please." Thomas continues, "If there's anything you can tell us that might help protect them." The teacup shatters in Grace's hand, tea spilling across the tablecloth. Johnny jumps up to clean the mess, but Grace remains still, seemingly unaware of the broken porcelain cutting into her palm. "Gran, you're bleeding." Johnny gently opens her clenched fist, picking out shards of the cup. Thomas rises to help, but freezes when Grace finally speaks, her voice raspy from disuse. "The flood." She whispers so softly Thomas almost misses it. "It starts with the flood." Johnny looks up in shock. "Gran, did you just 20 years ago?" She continues, her eyes distant, "The worst spring rains anyone could remember. Crescent Creek rose 15 feet in a single night." Thomas sits back down, hardly daring to breathe after 2 years of silence. Grace Sullivan is speaking. "We were high enough here at the ranch," she says, "but townfolk weren't so lucky. The emergency sirens failed. Harold heard about the rising water on his ham radio." She allows Johnny to bandage her hand, never breaking her story's rhythm. "My husband woke me at 2 hours in the morning, already dressed. The valley's flooding. He said, 'People are trapped.' Before I could answer, he was out the door, heading to the stables." Thomas remembers that night. The pounding rain, the confusion, the rising waters that came so fast, many had no warning. "Harold took 11 horses. Grace continues, our strongest, smartest. Ones he rode Thunder's sire Tempest and led the others, said he could reach places trucks couldn't." Her voice strengthens with each word, as though breaking through a dam. "I begged him to wait for daylight for the rescue teams. By then it'll be too late, he told me." Johnny sits back down, eyes wide. "Grandpa never told me this story, he wouldn't." Grace replies, a hint of her old warmth returning. "Harold never boasted about the good he did." "What happened next?" Thomas asks gently. "He rode out into that storm, leading those horses through the darkness. I didn't see him again for 2 days." Grace's eyes grow distant when he finally returned. He was different, quieter. He'd seen things in that flood, terrible things, but he'd also done something remarkable. She rises slowly from the table and walks to a cabinet in the corner. From a drawer, she withdraws a worn leather journal. Harold kept records of everything. She places the journal before Thomas, her fingers lingering on its cover. "That night he and those horses saved 23 lives. People trapped in remote cabins, stranded on rooftops, clinging to trees as the water rose around them." Thomas carefully opens the journal. Inside, in Harold's neat handwriting, are dated entries, detailed descriptions of rescue routes, names of those saved. Pressed between pages are newspaper clippings, faded photographs, handwritten thank you notes. When the rescue teams finally arrived, Grace continues, "They found Harold and his horses had already evacuated the most isolated homes. The horses carried children on their backs, pulled makeshift rafts through currents too dangerous for boats." Johnny looks bewildered. "Why didn't anyone ever tell this story? Grandpa should have been recognized as a hero." He refused any recognition, Grace says. Simply said anyone would have done the same. She takes a sip of fresh tea Johnny has prepared. But there was one place those horses couldn't reach in time. The old Miller homestead outpasted Silver Creek. Thomas feels a chill. The Gonzalez family, Grace nods. Joseph and Maria were caretakers for the property. They had 4 children, Harold heard their cries from across the valley. But the bridge had washed out by the time he found another way around. Her voice breaks. Only Joseph and Maria and their youngest daughter survived. The kitchen falls silent. Thomas remembers the funerals. The grief that enveloped Meadow Creek for months afterward. Harold blamed himself, Grace whispers, said if he'd been faster, if he'd taken a different route, those children might have lived. I told him he did everything humanly possible, but he carried that weight until the day he died. She turns a page in the journal revealing a map of Crescent Valley, with various routes marked in different colors after the flood. Harold made a promise. Every Sunday morning, rain or shine, he would ride out to St. Matthew's Church with those 11 horses. He'd pray for those he couldn't save and give thanks for those he could every Sunday. Johnny asks, incredulous, for 20 years. Grace nods. Never missed. Once I told him God doesn't keep talls of church attendance, but Harold said it wasn't about that. It was about remembrance, about honoring a promise. Thomas begins to understand, and when Harold died, the horses continued without him. Grace finishes. They remembered the route, the day, the time, that first Sunday after the funeral. I looked out my window at dawn and saw them, 11 horses lined up outside the stable waiting. But Harold wasn't there to lead them. Tears fill her eyes. So they went anyway. Johnny reaches for his grandmother's hand. That's why you started going to church again, to see them, to be with a part of him that still lives. She corrects softly. Those horses are carrying on Harold's promise when he no longer can. How could I not bear witness to such faithfulness? Thomas checks his watch. Nearly 9 The council meeting is in less than 24 hours. Grace, will you come to the town meeting tomorrow? Tell this story. Fear flashes across her face. I haven't spoken in public since. I know it's asking a lot. Thomas interrupts gently, but without your testimony, those horses might be rounded up, separated. Maybe even sold off. Harold's legacy would end. Grace stares out the kitchen window into the darkness. Those horses were family. To Harold, they knew him better than most people did. She takes a deep breath. I'll come for Harold for them. As Thomas rises to leave, Grace catches his arm. There's something else you should know. Mayor Collins wasn't always against the horses. What? Do you mean Richard Collins was one of the people Harold saved that night? He was just a young deputy, then trapped in his patrol car when the creek overflowed. Tempest pulled him out minutes before the car was swept away. Thomas frowns. Then why is he so determined to remove them now? Grace's expression hardens because power makes people forget their debts. Thomas and Richard Collins has always craved power more than he valued truth. The revelation sits heavy in Thomas's mind as he drives back toward town. The headlights of his truck cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty country road. He wonders how many times Harold Sullivan had traveled this same path, 11 horses in formation behind him, fulfilling a promise born from both triumph and tragedy. Back in town, lights still burn in the windows of the mayor's office. Thomas parks across the street, watching as Richard Collins and Diane Peterson exit the building, deep in conversation. They're joined by Frank Miller, the rancher, known for his rough handling of wild horses. The three shake hands before parting ways. Thomas's grip tightens on the steering wheel. Tomorrow's meeting isn't just about horses disrupting the peace. It's about erasing a reminder of the town's darkest day and one man's enduring promise to never forget it. As he drives home, Thomas passes St. Matthew's Church, its white steeple gleaming in the moonlight. He slows, noticing movement in the churchyard. Pulling over, he kills the headlights and peers. Through the darkness, 11 horses stand in silent formation before the church steps, their outlines barely visible in the night. At their head, thunder remains motionless as though standing guard, impossible. Thomas whispers, "They only come on Sunday." Mornings, never at night. He blinks and the vision vanishes. Just shadows and moonlight playing tricks on an old man's eyes. Or perhaps something more. Thomas continues home with renewed determination. Tomorrow he'll fight for these horses with everything he has, for Harold Sullivan's memory, for Grace's broken heart, and for 11 magnificent creatures who demonstrate more loyalty and purpose than most humans he's known. Morning arrives with lean skies, threatening rain. Fitting weather for the battle. Ahead, Thomas spends hours reviewing Harold's journal, making notes of key dates and details. The flood, the rescues, the weekly pilgrimage that continued even after death. A knock at his door reveals Ellie Montgomery, the veterinarian, clutching a stack of photographs. "I've been documenting the horses for months," she explains, spreading the pictures across Thomas's kitchen table. "Look at their formation. It never varies, and their timing is precise to the minute." Thomas examines the images. Could they have been trained to do this? Trained horses might perform these patterns, yes, but to maintain such precise timing week after week without a handler? She shakes her head, and there's more. "I've been researching flood rescue operations involving horses. It's extremely rare. Thomas, what Harold Sullivan did was extraordinary." She pulls out an old newspaper. "I found this in the archives. It's the only public mention of Harold's involvement in the flood rescue." The small article buried on page 6 briefly notes that local rancher Harold Sullivan assisted emergency services with evacuations. In remote areas, no details, no recognition of the lives saved. Mayor Collins was the sheriff's deputy, who handled press at the time. Ellie notes he controlled the narrative. Thomas frowns. But why downplay Harold's heroism? "I have a theory," Ellie says, lowering her voice, though no one else is present according to emergency protocols. "The valley evacuation should have begun hours earlier. Someone made a judgment call to delay the warning, and people died because of it." Thomas finishes the pieces, falling into place, including 3 of the Gonzalez children exactly. And guess who was manning the emergency management office that night? Richard Collins. The name tastes bitter in Thomas's mouth. Ellie nods grimly. If Harold's full story came to light, people might start asking uncomfortable questions about why the evacuation order came so late. The town hall parking lot is filled to capacity by 6:30 that evening. Thomas arrives early with Grace Sullivan on his arm, Johnny following close. Behind, the elderly woman walks slowly but with purpose, clutching Harold's journal to her chest. Like a shield inside, the meeting room buzzes with tension on one side. Sit those who've come to support the horses: Reverend Hayes, Ellie Montgomery, Michael Reynolds, and several church members. On the other, Diane Peterson has gathered a group of concerned citizens, many holding signs reading, "Safety first and protect our children." At precisely 7, Mayor Collins calls the meeting to order, his gavel echoing through the packed room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to address the ongoing situation regarding unidentified wild horses trespassing on town property, specifically around St. Matthew's Church." His voice carries the practiced authority of a career politician. "This council will hear concerns from both sides before voting on appropriate action." Thomas notices how carefully Richard avoids any personal connection to the horses, referring to them as if they're stray dogs rather than the magnificent creatures that have captured the town's imagination. Diane Peterson speaks first, her presentation well rehearsed. "These horses pose a significant safety risk. They block access to the church, create traffic hazards on Sunday mornings, and their unpredictable nature threatens our children." She distributes photographs of thunder rearing up, conveniently omitting that the image was captured when a tourist tried to touch him uninvited. Frank Miller, the rancher hired to remove the horses, offers his professional assessment. "Wild horses can't be allowed to roam freely through populated areas. It's dangerous and irresponsible. I propose rounding them up and either auctioning suitable ones or relocating the rest to Bureau of Land Management territory." Throughout these presentations, Grace Sullivan sits motionless, her eyes fixed on the mayor. Thomas wonders if she'll find her voice when the time comes. Finally, Reverend Hayes rises to defend the horses. He speaks eloquently about their peaceful presence, how they've never caused harm, how they've become a symbol of something mysterious and beautiful in their small town. Michael Reynolds follows, with historical context about the flood anniversary, suggesting the horses' appearance might be connected to that tragic event. When Ellie Montgomery presents her scientific observations, Mayor Collins frequently interrupts with questions designed to undermine her expertise. "So you admit, Dr. Montgomery, that you have no scientific explanation for this behavior?" "That's correct," Ellie concedes. "But absence of explanation isn't grounds for removal. These horses are healthy and non-aggressive, yet you can't guarantee they'll remain non-aggressive." Collins counters, earning murmurs of agreement from Diane's supporters. Finally, Thomas's name is called. He stands surprised by his own steadiness. Mayor Collins' council members, I come before you tonight, not just as the caretaker of St. Matthew's, but as someone who believes these horses are carrying on a legacy this town has forgotten or chosen to ignore. He recounts what Grace has shared. Harold Sullivan's rescue efforts during the flood, the lives saved, the weekly ritual that honored both survivors and victims. These horses aren't just random wild animals, Thomas concludes. They're the descendants of 11 brave horses that saved 23 lives 20 years ago, including some people in this very room. His gaze fixes on Mayor Collins, whose expression remains impassive. I'd like to call a witness who can verify this account. Thomas says Mrs. Grace Sullivan. A hush falls over the room as Grace rises shakily to her feet. For many present, this is the first time they've heard her voice in 2 years. She walks slowly to the front, Johnny hovering protectively behind her. Mrs. Sullivan, Thomas says gently, would you tell us about the night of the flood and what your husband Harold did? The town hall falls silent as Grace Sullivan takes her place at the podium for a moment. She simply stands there, frail hands gripping the wooden edges, her gaze sweeping across familiar faces. Some look away, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. Others lean forward, eager for the words of a woman who has kept silent for 2 years. My husband, Grace begins, her voice thin but clear, was a man who believed actions speak louder than words. She opens Harold's journal carefully. 20 years ago, when Crescent Creek flooded, the emergency warning came too late for many in the valley. Harold heard distress calls on his radio and didn't wait for official rescue teams. Mayor Collins shifts uncomfortably in his chair. Thomas notices the movement, subtle as it is at 2 in the morning in the worst storm I've ever seen. My husband took 11 horses into the flood tempest. Thunder's father led them for 2 days. Those horses wed through chest to water, carried children on their backs, and pulled people from rooftops. Her voice strengthens with each word. They reach places no vehicle could access. They cross currents too dangerous for boats. Grace turns a page in the journal and continues. The Davidson family trapped in their attic. The Wilkinsons clinging to their roof as their house foundation crumbled. Old Mr. Benson found unconscious in a tree. Her eyes find Mayor Collins and a young deputy, Richard Collins, whose patrol car was swept off Mercy Bridge. Murmurs ripple through the crowd. The mayor's face pales slightly. 23 souls saved, Grace continues. But there were others Harold couldn't reach in time. The Miller homestead, where 3 Gonzalez children drowned. My husband heard their cries, but the bridge was gone. He tried to find another way around, but her voice breaks. He was too late. Johnny steps forward, placing a steadying hand on his grandmother's shoulder. Grace draws strength from his presence and continues. After the flood, Harold made a vow. Every Sunday morning at precisely 7:35, he would ride to St. Matthew's Church with those same 11 horses. He would arrive as the first hymn began and stay until the final prayer at 10:23. Then he would ride home. He did this for 20 years, never missing once. She looks up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. He wasn't particularly religious, but he believed in keeping promises. This was his way of honoring those he saved and remembering those he lost. From his seat, Thomas watches Mayor Collins's expression harden, his jaw clenching visibly. When Harold died, Grace continues, I thought his promise died with him. But the very next Sunday, I looked out my window at dawn and saw 11 horses lined up outside our stable. No handler, no guide, just waiting. Her voice drops to a near whisper. They've kept Harold's promise when he no longer could. The room remains utterly silent as Grace closes the journal and addresses the council directly. You want to know why these horses come to church every Sunday? They're fulfilling a sacred trust. They're remembering what some in this town have worked very hard to forget. Mayor Collins leans forward, his voice tight. Mrs. Sullivan, while this is certainly a touching story, it doesn't address the safety concerns these wild animals pose. They aren't just wild animals, Richard. Grace interrupts, her tone suddenly sharp, and you of all people should know that a tense silence falls as their gazes lock across the room. When Tempest pulled you from that patrol car, Grace continues, you promised Harold you would never forget. You said you owed him your life. She produces a yellowed envelope from within the journal. You wrote this letter to my husband after the flood. Would you like me to read it aloud? The mayor's face drains of color. That's not necessary, Mrs. Sullivan. I believe it is. Grace unfolds the letter with trembling fingers. Dear Mr. Sullivan, there are no words adequate to express my gratitude for your actions on the night of May 17th. When the waters rose around my vehicle and the radio failed, I was certain my life was ending. The sight of you and your magnificent horse emerging from the darkness was nothing short of miraculous. I owe you a debt I can never repay. But please know that I will honor your courage for the rest of my days with eternal gratitude. Deputy Richard Collins. She refolds the letter carefully. Eternal gratitude seems to have a rather short expiration date in your case. Mayor Collins, the council chamber erupts in whispered conversations. Thomas exchanges a glance with Ellie, who nods slightly, understanding passing between them the mayor's eagerness to remove the horses. Suddenly makes perfect sense. They are living reminders of his broken promise of the night when Harold Sullivan became the hero. Collins failed to be the mayor. Bangs his gavel, repeatedly order, "Please, Mrs. Sullivan, while I appreciate your contribution, this emotional appeal doesn't change the fact that you delayed the evacuation order." Grace cuts in a voice carrying clearly through the now silent room that you assured emergency services the water wouldn't rise past the county line, that your miscalculation cost lives. Collins stands abruptly. That's an outrageous accusation with no relevance to tonight's discussion. I believe it has every relevance, Michael Reynolds interjects, rising from his seat with a folder in hand as town historian. I've been reviewing the emergency response records from the flood. They show a 90-minute delay between the National Weather Service flash flood warning and the town's evacuation order. Protocol required immediate action. Mayor Collins's face flushes. With anger, ancient history has no bearing on the current safety issue these horses present. Then let's talk about current safety. Ellie Montgomery stands presenting her documentation in 2 years of monitoring these horses. Not a single aggressive incident has occurred. The only reported injury happened when Billy Harrison climbed onto the church roof without permission and fell, an accident entirely unrelated to the horse's behavior. From the back of the room, Maria Gonzalez rises slowly. The sight of her silences everyone. As the mother who lost 3 children in the flood, her presence carries moral weight. Few in Meadow Creek can match. I have watched these horses come to the church every Sunday for 2 years. She says, her accent still thick after decades in Kentucky. Each time I think of my children, each time I remember how Harold Sullivan tried to save them. She pauses, emotion visible on her weathered face. These horses honor my children's memory. They honor Harold's courage. I will not stand by while you erase this tribute to both. Mayor Collins looks increasingly isolated as more community members stand to defend the horses. Even Diane Peterson appears uncomfortable now, avoiding the mayor's gaze. I believe we've heard enough testimony. Reverend Hayes suggests perhaps we should move to a vote. The mayor, recognizing his position, weakening, attempts one final argument. These are still wild animals on public property. The liability alone can be addressed through proper signage and basic precautions. Sheriff Cooper interjects. Speaking for the first time, my department can ensure safety without removing the horses, and I'd be happy to provide regular health checks, Ellie adds, to ensure they remain in good condition. Thomas watches as Mayor Collins realizes he's losing control of the narrative he's carefully constructed. The man's political instincts kick in, and he shifts tactics visibly. Perhaps, Collins says carefully, in light of this new historical information, we should consider a compromise rather than removal. We could establish a designated viewing area, keeping people at a safe distance while allowing the horses to continue their ritual. Thomas exchanges knowing glances. With Grace, it's a transparent attempt to save face, but it would achieve their primary goal. Protecting the horses, the council votes 6-1 in favor of the compromise, with only Diane Peterson dissenting. The meeting adjourns and people gather in, small groups buzzing with the evening's revelations as the crowd disperses. Thomas notices Mayor Collins approach Grace Sullivan, their conversation just out of earshot. The exchange appears tense but brief when Grace returns to Thomas's side. Her expression reveals nothing. What did he say? Thomas asks. He asked me not to share his letter publicly. She slips Harold's journal back into her purse. I told him my silence would depend entirely on how those horses are treated going forward. Thomas smiles, recognizing the quiet strength that made her Harold Sullivan's perfect match. Political blackmail, Mrs. Sullivan. I'm impressed. I prefer to call it insurance. She replies with the ghost of a smile. Harold taught me that actions speak louder than words, but sometimes the threat of words can inspire better actions. Sunday dawns clear and crisp, the autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant woods. Thomas arrives at St. Matthew's earlier than usual, surprised to find a crowd already gathering. Word of Grace's testimony has spread throughout Meadow Creek, and beyond, cars with out-of-county license plates line the street, visitors hoping to witness the Sunday miracle for themselves. The new safety measures are already in place, a simple split-rail fence creating a viewing area at a respectful distance from the church steps. Sheriff Cooper and a deputy direct traffic and remind excited tourists about the rules. No approaching the horses, no flash photography, no loud noises at precisely 7:35. A ripple of anticipation passes through the crowd from the eastern ridge. 11 silhouettes appear against the morning sky. Thunder leads, his black coat gleaming in the sunlight, white star prominent on his forehead. Behind him, the others maintain perfect formation as they make their way down the hillside. Thomas stands on the church steps, watching their approach beside him. Reverend Hayes adjusts his collar nervously. Quite a turnout, the minister remarks. I've prepared a special sermon about faithfulness, seemed appropriate. The horses reach the churchyard and assume their positions, forming the familiar semicircle facing the entrance. Thomas notices something different about them today. They seem more alert, their ears forward, eyes bright. Perhaps they sense the larger crowd, or perhaps they somehow understand that their future is secure from his peripheral vision. Thomas sees a black SUV pull up. Mayor Collins steps out, straightening his tie. Before making his way toward the church, he nods curtly to Thomas, but says nothing as he enters the sanctuary. As the congregation files in, Grace Sullivan arrives with Johnny for the first time in 2 years. She's wearing a blue dress that brings out her eyes. She pauses before Thunder raising her hand in greeting. The stallion dips his head slightly, an acknowledgement between old friends. Inside, the church is filled beyond capacity. Latecomers stand along the walls as Reverend Hayes delivers his sermon on faithfulness and remembrance. Mayor Collins sits stiffly in the third row, his wife beside him. Thomas notices how the man's gaze keeps drifting toward the open doors where the horses remain visible, standing sentinel after the service. People linger in the churchyard, watching in fascination as the horses maintain their vigil. Grace approaches Thomas, her expression peaceful. "I've been thinking about selling the ranch," she says. "It's too much for me to maintain alone, and Johnny has his own life in Louisville." Thomas feels a pang of concern. "What about the horses if Sullivan Ranch is sold? That's what I wanted to discuss with you." She gestures toward the horses. They need protected land to roam, somewhere close enough to continue their Sunday visits. Thomas considers this challenge. The church owns 30 acres behind the cemetery. It's never been developed. Grace's eyes brighten. "Who would the board consider?" "I think after today the board would consider anything that keeps these horses coming," Thomas assures her. They've become quite the tourist attraction indeed. Local business owners are already noticing the economic impact. The diner across from the church has a line out the door. The gift shop on Main Street has hastily produced postcards featuring the Sunday horses of Meadow Creek at precisely 10:23 as the church bells chime. Thunder raises his head and signals their departure. The crowd watches in awe as the 11 horses turn in unison and begin their journey back to the eastern hills, their movements as measured and dignified as their arrival. Thomas and Grace watch them disappear over the ridge. "Do you think they understand what they're doing?" Thomas asks quietly. "Or are they just following some pattern Harold established?" Grace considers the question. "I think there are bonds deeper than understanding. Harold connected with those horses in a way few people could comprehend. He always said they knew things we didn't, could sense danger, grief, joy." She pats Thomas's hand. "Whatever drives them to come each Sunday, I believe it honors not just Harold's memory but something fundamental about loyalty and promise-keeping that humans would do well to emulate as they walk back toward the church." Thomas notices Mayor Collins standing alone by the fence, watching the distant figures of the horses with an unreadable expression. For a moment, Thomas considers approaching him but decides against it. Some reckonings are private, between a man and his conscience in the weeks that follow. Thomas works with the church board to designate the back acreage, As a sanctuary for the horses, Grace negotiates the sale of most of Sullivan Ranch, retaining only the house and 5 acres for herself. The proceeds establish a trust for the whore's care and feeding Ellie. Montgomery develops a conservation plan ensuring the horses can maintain their wild nature while receiving necessary veterinary care. Signs appear along the route. The horses travel. Sullivan Memorial Trail. Please respect wildlife. The story of Harold Sullivan's flood rescues finally receives proper recognition. Michael Reynolds creates an exhibit at the town's small historical society, featuring Harold's journal photographs of the 11 original horses and testimonials from those saved that night. 20 years ago, Mayor Collins, perhaps seeking to rehabilitate his image, donates generously to the Horse Sanctuary Fund, though he never publicly acknowledges his role in delaying the flood evacuation. His private support suggests a man attempting to make amends with his past. For Thomas Whitaker, the horses bring purpose to his widowed life. Each Sunday he rises before dawn to watch their approach, marveling at the mystery of their unwavering devotion. Sometimes in the golden light of morning he imagines Harold Sullivan riding alongside them, keeping his promise through these magnificent creatures who carry his legacy forward. And in a small house at the edge of what was once Sullivan Ranch, Grace sits on her porch each Sunday afternoon watching 11 wild horses return from their pilgrimage. Her 2 years of silence have given way to a new voice, one that shares Harold's story with visitors who come from across the country to witness the Sunday horses of Meadow Creek. They keep coming back, she tells a journalist who asks what motivates the horses' weekly journey. Just like faith, just like memory, just like love. Some bonds transcend explanation. They simply endure. 3 months pass, and winter settles over Meadow Creek. Snow blankets, the rolling hills transforming the landscape into a sea of white. Despite the freezing temperatures, the horses continue their Sunday pilgrimage, leaving perfect hoof prints in the fresh snow. As they make their way to St. Matthew's, the town has embraced its newfound identity as home to the Sunday horses. Gift shops along Main Street sell commemorative mugs and T-shirts. The Meadow Creek Gazette publishes a weekly column called Horse Whispers, documenting sightings and stories. Tourism has increased so significantly that Linda Cooper, the sheriff's wife, has expanded her diner to accommodate weekend visitors on this particular Sunday morning. Thomas shivers on the church steps, watching his breath form clouds in the frigid air. The temperature has dropped to 15 degrees overnight, and concern for the horses weighs on his mind. He's arranged bales of hay near the church entrance and filled water troughs that Ellie has assured him won't freeze. Thanks to special heating elements, think they'll come in this weather? Reverend Hayes asks, joining Thomas on the steps bundled in a heavy coat. They haven't missed once in 2 years, Thomas replies, checking his watch. Not even in last February's blizzard. As if summoned by his faith, dark shapes appear on the horizon, 11 horses moving methodically through knee-deep snow. Their approach slower than usual, but no less determined. Thunder leads his black coat stark against the white landscape, steam rising from his nostrils with each breath. Remarkable. The Reverend whispers. The horses reach the churchyard, taking their usual positions despite the snow. Thomas notices how they stand closer together than normal, conserving heat. Even in these harsh conditions, their ritual remains unchanged. Inside, the church fills quickly. Winter has done nothing to diminish attendance. If anything, the arduous journey through snow makes the horses' appearance even more spectacular. Thomas spots Grace Sullivan in her usual place. Johnny beside the elderly woman has flourished since breaking her silence, becoming something of a local celebrity. She's been interviewed by regional newspapers and even made an appearance on a Kentucky morning television program, sharing Harold's story with quiet dignity after the service as parishioners file out into the cold. Thomas approaches Johnny Sullivan. How's your grandmother holding up? This weather can't be easy on her. Johnny smiles, watching Grace chat with church members. Better than I could have imagined. It's like she's come back to life these past few months. He lowers his voice. She's thinking about writing a book about Grandpa and the horses. Michael Reynolds is helping her with the research. That's wonderful. Thomas notices something in Johnny's expression, but the younger man sighs. I worry about her, rattling around in that big house alone. I've tried to convince her to move to Louisville with me, but she refuses to leave. She needs to be near the horses. Thomas observes, exactly. She says, as long as they keep coming to church, she needs to be here to witness it. Their conversation is interrupted by a commotion near the church entrance. Ellie Montgomery rushes toward them, her face etched with concern. "Thomas," it's Whisper. She's limping badly. They hurry outside to find the small white mare struggling. To maintain her position in the formation, her right front leg barely touches the ground and pain clouds her usually bright eyes. She must have injured herself on the journey. Here, Ellie explains, carefully approaching the horse. The other horses shift slightly, making room while maintaining their semicircle. "I need to examine her, but not here. She needs shelter and treatment. The church basement has an outside entrance. Thomas suggests we could bring her in there." Ellie shakes her head. She won't leave the others, and they won't leave until the bells ring at 10:23. Thomas checks his watch. Another 40 minutes. Can she wait that long? I don't think we have a choice. Ellie kneels in the snow, examining Whisper from a distance. It doesn't appear to be broken. But she's in pain. News of Whisper's injury spreads quickly. The crowd keeps a respectful distance, but concern is evident on every face. Grace makes her way through the snow, moving with surprising agility for her age. Harold had a special connection with Whisper, she tells Thomas, watching the injured mare with worried eyes. She was the youngest of his horses, born right after the flood. He bottle-fed her when her mother died. Thomas notices Mayor Collins hovering at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable since the town meeting. He's maintained a careful neutrality regarding the horses, neither supporting nor opposing their presence at precisely 10:23. The church bells chime. Thunder lifts his head, signaling departure. As always, the horses turn toward the hills, but Whisper remains motionless, clearly unable to make the journey home for the first time in 2 years. The perfect ritual faces disruption. The other horses appear confused, hesitating in their departure. Thunder returns to Whisper's side, nudging her gently, but the mare's injury prevents her from moving with the herd. "Now what?" Johnny asks. They won't leave her, but she can't travel. Thomas watches the horses' dilemma with growing concern. If they remain in the churchyard exposed to the elements, Whisper's condition could worsen. The other horses might also suffer in the prolonged cold. Unexpectedly, Mayor Collins steps forward. "Sullivan Ranch is closest. We could transport the injured horse there." All eyes turn to him in surprise, and the others. Thomas asks. They'll follow. The mayor states with unexpected certainty. "Harold always said they move as one if we take care of the weakest. The others will stay connected." Grace studies Richard Collins with newfound interest. "You remember his words more than you might think." Mrs. Sullivan, a flush that has nothing to do with the cold, creeps up the mayor's neck. "I have a horse. Trailer? Attached to my truck, we can carefully load Whisper and drive slowly to your ranch. If these horses are anything like the ones Harold trained, though others will follow within minutes, a plan takes shape with Ellie's guidance. They carefully coax Whisper into the mayor's trailer. The mayor is reluctant at first, but Thunder's presence nearby seems to calm her once secured. Collins climbs into his truck. "Drive very slowly." Grace instructs, "No more than walking pace." The mayor nods, starting the engine. As the trailer begins its careful journey towards Sullivan Ranch, Thomas holds his breath, watching the remaining horses for a moment. They stand motionless, seemingly uncertain. Then Thunder lets out a soft neigh and begins walking behind. The trailer, one by one, the others fall into formation. Following their injured companion, a motorcade forms spontaneously. Collins's truck in front, the 10 horses behind, and various cars and trucks bringing up the rear. They process slowly through town, creating an impromptu parade watched by curious residents from windows and doorways at Sullivan Ranch. The old stables haven't been used since Harold's death. Dust covers the stalls and cobwebs hang from the rafters. Yet as Grace pushes open the heavy wooden doors, memories seem to awaken in the weathered building. "Harold kept this stall for medical needs," she says, indicating a larger space at the end of the row. "It should work for Whisper." They carefully unload the injured mare while the other horses gather outside the stable. Ellie examines Whisper thoroughly, relief evident in her voice when she announces, "It's a sprain, not a break. With proper rest and care, she should recover fully." "How long will that take?" Thomas asks. "At least 3 weeks. She can't make the journey to the church during that time." A troubling question hangs in the air. Will the other horses continue their Sunday ritual without Whisper, or will her injury end the tradition completely? Mayor Collins breaks the uncomfortable silence. "We could arrange transportation for all of them next Sunday. Bring them to the church in trailers." Grace shakes her head firmly. That's not how it works. They come on their own or not at all. That's the point of Harold's promise. It must be kept willingly as darkness falls. Volunteers help clean the stable and make it comfortable for Whisper. The other horses refuse to leave, standing vigil outside the building. Grace invites everyone inside for hot coffee and sandwiches, her home filling with people for the first time in years. In the kitchen, Thomas finds himself unexpectedly alone with Mayor Collins. The politician stares out the window at the horses, his expression contemplative. "You knew them before, didn't you?" Thomas asks quietly. "Harold's original horses," Collins nods slowly. "After the flood. When I wrote that letter to Harold, I meant every word. I started visiting the ranch, helping with chores, learning about the horses." A faint smile touches his lips. "Tempest thunders, sire." He was something special, could sense a storm coming hours before the first cloud appeared. "What happened? Why did you stop coming?" The mayor's smile fades. "Politics happened. I ran for sheriff, then mayor, got busy with campaigns, budgets, infrastructure projects." He sighed heavily. "And every Sunday Harold would ride past my house with those horses. A living reminder of my broken promise to never forget." Thomas studies the man beside him, seeing past the political facade to the conflicted person beneath. "It's not too late to honor that promise." Collins turns from the window. "That's why I'm here." Thomas, not as the mayor, but as the young deputy who owes his life to Harold. Sullivan and his horses. The next morning, Thomas arrives early at Sullivan Ranch to check on Whisper. He finds Grace already in the stable, brushing the mayor's white coat, while softly humming a hymn. "How is she?" Thomas asks. "Better. Ellie's medicine has reduced the swelling." Grace continues her gentle grooming. The others spent the night in the corral. First time they've stayed in one place since Harold died. Thomas looks out at the remaining horses grazing peacefully in the morning light. "Do you think they'll go to church next Sunday without her?" Grace sets down the brush, her weathered face serene. "Harold used to say, these horses understood faith better than most people. They know what matters." Throughout the week, a steady stream of visitors makes the journey to Sullivan Ranch. Children from Meadow Creek Elementary bring carrots and drawings for Whisper. Reverend Hayes holds an impromptu prayer service. In the stable, blessing the injured mare and her companions, even Diane Peterson, once the horse's most vocal opponent, drops off a load of premium hay mare. Collins visits daily, arriving after work hours, to help with evening feedings. His expertise with horses surprises Thomas until Grace explains that Richard spent an entire summer working at Sullivan Ranch after the flood, learning horsemanship from Harold himself. "Harold saw something in that boy," Grace remarks, watching Collins brushed thunder with practiced ease. Said Richard had natural instincts with horses, just needed guidance. "What changed him?" Thomas wonders. "Ambition is a powerful distraction." Grace replies simply, "By Friday." Whisper shows marked improvement, walking carefully around the stable with minimal discomfort. The other horses grow increasingly restless, often gathering at the eastern fence line as if preparing for their journey. Saturday evening brings thick clouds and weather warnings. An ice storm approaches from the west, promising treacherous conditions. By morning, Thomas helps Grace secure the stable doors against the coming weather. "Maybe we should bring all the horses inside tonight," he suggests, eyeing the darkening sky. Grace follows his gaze, but shakes her head. They need to choose Thomas. That's the heart of Harold's legacy, that they come to the church of their own free will. Not because we shelter or constrain them as predicted. Morning brings sheets of ice coating every surface. Tree branches sag under frozen weight and power lines droop dangerously. The road to St. Matthew's is virtually impossible. Reverend Hayes calls Thomas early, his voice crackling through a bad connection. "We're canceling service today. It's too dangerous for people to travel." Thomas relays the news to Grace, who nods in understanding, but insists on checking the horses. They bundle against the biting cold and make their way to the stable. Whisper stands alert in her stall, ears pricked forward as if listening for something outside. The corral stands empty. All 10 horses have vanished. They've gone. Grace whispers, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, despite the ice. Thomas checks his watch, 7:15. If they keep to their usual pace, they'll reach the church at 7:35, exactly on schedule. But there's no service today, Grace reminds him. No one will be there. A certainty settles in Thomas's heart. We will. The drive to St. Matthew's is perilous, ice making the roads treacherous. Thomas navigates with extreme caution. the truck's tires crunching over frozen ruts beside him. Grace remains, silent, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. They pass abandoned vehicles that have slid into ditches. Power lines hang dangerously low, weighted with ice. The world feels suspended, crystallized in winter's harsh embrace. They approach the church. Thomas gasps at the sight before them. 10 horses stand in their familiar formation before the steps, ice glazing their manes and tails like crystal decorations. They maintain their positions, despite the storm, loyalty, unwavering. Look at them, Grace whispers, tears freezing on her cheeks. They came anyway. Thomas parks carefully and helps Grace from the truck. They approach the horses, slowly marveling at their determination. Thunder acknowledges them with a slight movement of his head, but the others remain fixed in their ritual stance. The church is locked. Thomas realizes Reverend Hayes canneled the service. Grace reaches into her purse and produces a set of keys. Harold was on the building committee for 40 years. They never asked for these back after he died. Inside, the church feels different without its usual Sunday congregation. Both emptier and somehow more sacred. Thomas turns on minimal lights, while Grace heads for the organ. You play. Thomas asks, in surprise. Took lessons as a girl. She sits on the bench, removes her gloves, and places her fingers on the keys. The opening notes of Amazing Grace fill the silent sanctuary. Thomas opens the church doors wide so the music can reach the horses waiting outside. Through the doorway, he watches them shift slightly, ears moving in response to the familiar hymn for the next hour. Grace plays every hymn she can remember, her fingers growing more confident with each piece. Thomas alternates between sitting in a pew and checking on the horses, who remain steadfast, despite the worsening weather, at precisely 10:23. Though no bells can ring with the power out, the horses turn in unison and begin their journey. Back to Sullivan Ranch, Thomas and Grace follow in the truck, maintaining a respectful distance. The image of those 10 horses moving with perfect synchronicity through an ice-covered landscape strikes Thomas as one of the most profound displays of devotion he has ever witnessed. Back at the ranch, they find Whisper standing anxiously at her stall door when the other horses arrive. Their reunion is a quiet affair. Gentle nickers and nudges, speaking a language of connection that transcends human understanding. That night, the story of the horse journey through the ice storm spreads quickly, traveling by phone and word of mouth, despite power outages across the county. By Monday morning, as crews work to restore electricity and clear roads, the tale has reached mythic proportions. People need stories like this, Michael Reynolds tells Thomas when they meet at Linda's diner for coffee. Especially in hard times, these horses remind us that some promises are worth keeping no matter the cost. Thomas nods, warming his hands around his mug. I've been thinking about what Grace said, that Harold believed these horses understood faith better than most people. And do you think that's true? Thomas considers the question carefully. I think they understand loyalty and purpose, whether you call that faith or something else. There's wisdom in their constancy as the ice begins to melt, revealing patches of ground beneath the horses of Sullivan Ranch. Continue their quiet existence, unaware of their growing legend for them. There is only the rhythm of days, the warmth of their herd, and the unspoken promise that guides them every Sunday to a white church on the hill, where they stand as living monuments to one man's courage and unwavering devotion. Spring arrives in Meadow Creek, bringing renewed life to the Kentucky hills. Wild flowers carpet the field surrounding Sullivan Ranch, and the horses grow sleek with fresh grazing. Whisper has fully recovered, rejoining the Sunday procession to St. Matthew's Church. With her characteristic grace, the 20th anniversary of the Crescent Valley flood approaches, casting a reflective mood over the town. Michael Reynolds has organized a memorial exhibit at the Historical Society, featuring photographs, news clippings, and personal accounts of that devastating night. Harold Sullivan's journal occupies a place of honor, open to pages describing the rescue efforts on a mild Tuesday afternoon. Thomas sits with Grace on her front porch, watching the horses graze. In the distance between them rests a large scrapbook filled with articles and photographs chronicling the Sunday horses phenomenon. National Geographic, called Yesterday. Grace remarks, pouring iced tea into tall glasses. They want to send a photographer for the anniversary commemoration. Thomas shakes his head in amazement. Harold would have hated all this attention. True, Grace acknowledges with a small smile, but he would have loved that his horses are still keeping his promise. Their conversation is interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black car. With government plates, a middle-aged woman in a crisp suit emerges carrying a leather portfolio. Mrs. Sullivan, she calls, approaching the porch. "I'm Catherine Martinez from the State Historic Preservation Office. May I have a moment of your time, Grace?" Invites her to join them, offering tea, which Ms. Martinez politely declines. "I've been sent to evaluate the Sullivan Memorial Trail for potential designation as a state historic site," she explains, opening her portfolio to reveal official-looking documents. "The governor's office has taken an interest in your story." Thomas and Grace exchange surprised glances. The trail the horses follow would be preserved with educational markers detailing the flood rescue operation. Ms. Martinez continues. "It would include protection for the grazing lands the horses currently use." "Who initiated this?" Thomas asks Mayor Collins. "Submitted the application," she replies, surprising them both. "He's been quite persistent, calling our office weekly to check on progress after Miss Martinez leaves, promising to return for the anniversary event." Thomas helps Grace prepare dinner as he chops vegetables. He purrs the mayor's unexpected advocacy. Richard is a politician. Grace observes, reading his thoughts. But that doesn't mean he's incapable of genuine redemption. Speaking of unexpected changes, Thomas says, "Changing the subject, Johnny mentioned you've been talking with Chief White Eagle from the Shawnee community." Grace nods, stirring a pot of stew. Robert White. Eagle's grandfather once told Harold that horses carry messages between worlds when I described our Sunday horses. The chief wasn't surprised at all. Her eyes grow distant. He said, "Some bonds transcend death. Promises made with pure intention create paths that remain open." "Do you believe that?" Thomas asks gently. "I believe Harold's love for these horses and for this town was strong enough to leave an imprint." She tastes the stew, adds a pinch of salt, whether you call it spiritual connection or behavioral. Conditioning hardly matters. The miracle is in their faithfulness as the anniversary approaches. Meadow Creek buzzes with preparations. The memorial will include a Sunday service at St. Matthew's, followed by a procession along the newly designated Sullivan Memorial Trail ending at the banks of Crescent Creek, where a permanent monument will be unveiled 3 days before the event disaster strikes. Frank Miller's teenage son crashes his truck into a power pole near Sullivan Ranch, bringing down lines that spark a grass fire. The blaze spreads rapidly toward the eastern pasture where the horses graze. Thomas is at the church when Sheriff Cooper calls with the news. Fire department's responding, but the winds are pushing it straight towards Sullivan land. The horses are in danger. Thomas drives at breakneck speed toward the ranch, heart pounding as he spots the column of smoke rising over the hills when he arrives. Chaos reigns. Fire, trucks block the driveway, and volunteers form a bucket line from the creek. Grace stands near the house, Johnny, keeping a protective arm around her shoulders as they watch firefighters battle the advancing flames. "The horses?" Thomas asks breathlessly. "Still in the east pasture," Johnny replies, pointing toward a distant ridge now obscured by smoke. Fire crews haven't been able to reach them. Thomas scans the scene, spotting Mayor Collins in conversation with the fire chief. He approaches them, catching fragments of their discussion about wind direction and containment strategies. "We need to get to the horses." Thomas interrupts. The fire chief shakes his head. "Too dangerous. That whole sector's about to be engulfed. We've got to focus on protecting the structures and preventing spread to neighboring properties. Those horses are living history." Thomas argues, "We can't just abandon them." "I'm sorry," the chief replies firmly. "I can't risk my men." Mayor Collins pulls Thomas aside. "There's another way to the east pasture, an old service road. Harold showed me years ago. It circles behind the ridge, approaching from the north. The fire hasn't reached that side yet. You remember it?" Thomas asks. "Surprise, some things you don't forget." Collins turns to his vehicle. "Come on, we don't have much time." Thomas climbs into the mayor's SUV, and they speed away from the main ranch entrance, taking a nearly invisible turn onto an overgrown track. The e-vehicle bounces violently over ruts and rocks as Collins navigates with intense concentration. Harold used this route during winter storms, he explains, swerving to avoid a fallen branch. Said it was the only path that stayed passable when the main road drifted over. They crest a small hill, and the east pasture comes into view below them through swirling smoke. Thomas spots the horses gathered at the far corner, trapped by advancing flames on two sides. There they are, he shouts. Collins parks, and they race down the hillside. The air grows increasingly thick with smoke, making breathing difficult as they approach the horses. Thomas sees their panic-wide eyes flared, nostrils nervous stamping. Even Thunder, normally so stoic, paces anxiously. They won't come to me. Thomas realizes, coughing as smoke burns his lungs. I don't have Harold's connection with them. To his astonishment, Collins steps forward, approaches Thunder directly, and whispers something in the stallion's ear. The horse calms immediately, focusing on the mare with unexpected recognition. How did you? No time to explain. Collins interrupts. We need to lead them up the north path away from the fire front with remarkable skill. Collins guides Thunder toward the hillside trail, the other horses instinctively following their leader. Thomas brings up the rear, ensuring no stragglers are left. Behind they move steadily uphill, the sound of crackling flames growing more distant with each step. By the time they reach the SUV, the smoke has thinned enough to see the ranch below. Fire crews are gaining control of the blaze, though the east pasture is now completely engulfed. You saved them, Thomas says, watching. Collins strokes Thunder's neck with familiar ease. The mayor's usual political mask has vanished, replaced by a raw vulnerability. Harold taught me more than horsemanship that summer. He showed me what it means to take responsibility for others. His voice catches. I failed to honor that lesson. Once I won't fail again. They lead the horses to temporary safety at George Harrison's neighboring farm. By nightfall, the fire is contained, having burned nearly 50 acres but spared the ranch buildings. The community rallies around Grace, bringing supplies for the horses and offers of assistance with cleanup. In the following days, work parties help clear debris and repair fencing the east pasture. Those scorched black will recover with time. More immediately concerning is the damage to the Sullivan Memorial Trail, parts of which are now impossible due to fallen trees and erosion. This changes the anniversary plans, Michael Reynolds laments during an emergency meeting of the commemoration committee. We can't lead a procession along a trail that no longer exists. We'll need to postpone. Reverend Hayes suggests reluctantly. Thomas, however, has been watching the horses closely since their return to the ranch. Despite the fire's destruction of their usual path, they seem oddly unperturbed, grazing contentedly in the north pasture. I don't think we need to change anything, he says. Finally, these horses found their way to church through an ice storm. They'll find their way despite a fire. Grace nods in agreement. Harold always said horses remember paths better than people. They don't need markers or signs. The morning of the anniversary dawns clear and mild. Television crews from regional stations set up equipment around St. Matthew's Church. The governor's office has sent a representative, and visitors from surrounding counties line the street. Everyone waits anxiously, wondering if the horses will appear. Despite the disruption to their established route at precisely 7:35, a murmur passes through the crowd. Thomas, standing on the church steps with Grace and Reverend Hayes, feels his heart lift at the sight on the horizon. 11 horses approach from an entirely new direction, having forged a path where none existed before. Thunder leads confidently, the others following in their accustomed formation. They found a way, Grace whispers, tears shining in her eyes. The horses take their positions before the church as they have every Sunday for 2 years. The special anniversary service proceeds with heightened emotion, the governor's representative announcing the official designation of the Sullivan Memorial Historic Site. Afterward, the planned procession follows the horses as they forge a new trail back to the ranch, their instinctive route becoming the official path going forward at Crescent Creek, where a simple stone monument now stands bearing the names of those lost in the flood. Maria Gonzalez places flowers in memory of her 3 children. The ceremony concludes with Grace Sullivan unveiling a bronze plaque featuring a relief of Harold on horseback, accompanied by the words, "Some promises outlive us, some journeys continue beyond our own." As summer settles over Meadow Creek, Thomas reflects on the transformative power of 11 horses who turned a personal promise into a communal legacy. The new Sullivan Memorial Historic Site brings steady tourism to the once struggling town. More importantly, it preserves both land and memory for future generations. One evening, as Thomas locks up the church after a meeting, he notices Mayor Gollin sitting alone in a back pew, staring at the stained glass window above the altar. Richard Thomas approaches cautiously. "Everything all right?" The mayor doesn't immediately respond. his gaze fixed on the colored light filtering through the glass. "I found some old photographs yesterday," he says. "Finally, from that summer I spent working for Harold." He hands Thomas a faded picture showing a much younger Richard Collins astride. A powerful gray stallion, unmistakably Tempest Thunder. "Sire, the resemblance between father and son is striking, Harold. Let me exercise him every day." Collins continues, said Tempest. "Chose me, not the other way around." He takes the photograph back, studying it with a mixture of nostalgia and regret. "When I decided to run for sheriff, I got busy, stopped visiting the ranch. Harold never complained, just tipped his hat. Whenever we passed in town, Thomas sits beside him, sensing there's more to the story. The night before he died," Collins says, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "Harold called me, asked if I'd come by the ranch. Said he had something important to discuss." He closes his eyes briefly. "I told him I was too busy with budget meetings, that I'd stop by next week." A bitter smile crosses his face. "There was no next week. You couldn't have known." Thomas offers gently, "That's not the point." Collins turns to face him directly. "All these years, I've wondered what he wanted to tell me, whether he knew his time was short, whether he was trying to entrust something to me. Maybe even the horses." Thomas considers this possibility. "Is that why you've become their advocate, to make amends?" Partly, Collins admits, "but it's also because when that fire threatened them and I whispered to Thunder, he knew me, Thomas. After all these years, that horse recognized something in me that I'd forgotten in myself." The sunlight shifts, casting rainbow patterns across the empty pews outside. The world continues its forward rush, but inside St. Matthew's, time seems to expand into something more circular, more forgiving. "It's never too late to keep a promise," Thomas says simply. Collins nods, tucking the photograph away. "That's what I'm counting." On Sunday after Sunday, through changing seasons and passing years, 11 horses make their pilgrimage to St. Matthew's Church. They become the subject of academic studies, documentary films, and countless personal pilgrimages from people seeking meaning. In their unwavering devotion, Thomas Whitaker, though his hair grows whiter and his steps slower, continues to watch over them as church caretaker. Keeping the doors open and the steps cleared for their weekly arrival, Grace Sullivan's book about Harold and his horses becomes a regional bestseller. Its royalties funding a scholarship for young equestrians. Mayor Collins serves 4 more terms before retiring to focus on the Sullivan Memorial Historic Site. Preservation efforts. New families move to Meadow Creek, drawn by its growing reputation as a place where extraordinary loyalty is an everyday occurrence. Children learn to tell time by the horse's arrival and departure. Lovers propose marriage in the churchyard after Sunday services. Believing such vows made in the presence of these faithful creatures carries special blessing. The horses themselves age with quiet dignity. When Willow, the oldest mare, passes peacefully in her sleep. One winter, the procession continues with 10. The following spring, a new foe born to autumn joins the Sunday journey. Maintaining the number at 11, life continues, renews, evolves on the 5th anniversary of their first appearance. National Geographic publishes a feature article titled "The Promise Keepers" of Meadow Creek, with a stunning photograph of the horses at dawn mist swirling around their legs as they approach the church. The writer, attempting to explain their behavior, concludes, "Science offers various theories conditioning herd mentality. Established patterns, but none fully capture what residents of this small Kentucky town understand intuitively, that some bonds transcend ordinary explanation, that loyalty creates its own kind of miracle." Thomas clips the article for his growing collection, adding it to the scrapbook he and Grace maintain. Later that afternoon, he walks alone to the hilltop overlooking both the church and Sullivan Ranch. From this vantage point, he can trace the newly established trail that connects these 2 anchors of Meadow Creek's identity. The setting sun bathes the landscape in golden light, and for a fleeting moment Thomas imagines he sees Harold Sullivan riding alongside his 11 faithful horses, all of them moving in perfect harmony toward home. Whether vision or memory or simply the play of evening shadows, it fills Thomas with profound peace. He understands now what Grace meant about bonds that transcend death, about promises creating paths that remain open. The horses of Meadow Creek have taught him that the most sacred journeys are the ones we continue for each other, that the truest form of remembrance is found not in monuments or plaques, but in faithful action repeated with love as darkness settles over the valley. Thomas makes his way back toward town, certain in the knowledge that come Sunday morning, 11 wild horses will appear on the horizon, keeping faith with a promise that has transformed an entire community, a living legacy of devotion that continues to break hearts and heal them. In the very same moment, autumn paints Meadow Creek in brilliant hues of red and gold. 5 years have passed since the horses first appeared at St. Matthew's, their Sunday ritual, now woven into the fabric of the town's identity. The Sullivan Memorial Historic Site attracts visitors from across the country, and Grace's book about Harold and the horses has entered its third printing. Thomas Whitaker, now approaching his late 70s, moves more slowly these days. His doctor has mentioned concerns about his heart, suggesting he reduce his responsibilities at the church. But Thomas cannot imagine surrendering his Sunday vigil, his role as witness to the whore's unwavering devotion. One crisp October morning, as Thomas unlocks the church doors, he notices a sleek silver tour bus parked across the street. Faith Journeys of America is emblazoned on its side in bold lettering. A group of about 30 people, cameras at the ready, clusters near the church steps. First tour group of the day. Reverend Hayes remarks, appearing beside Thomas. 3 more scheduled. Before noon, the Sunday crowds keep growing. Thomas nods, his feelings mixed. While the horse's story deserves to be shared, something about the commercialization of their ritual troubles him. Camera flashes, chattering tourists, the occasional drone hovering overhead, all intrude upon what was once a sacred, quiet moment. Sometimes I wonder what Harold would think of all this. Thomas confesses he'd hate the attention. The Reverend agrees with a soft chuckle, but he'd appreciate that people recognize the value of keeping promises. As 7:35 approaches, the churchyard fills with expectant visitors. Thomas takes his customary position on the steps, watching the eastern horizon. The horses appear right on schedule, moving with their characteristic grace. Through the autumn landscape, Thunder, showing subtle signs of age but still majestic, leads the familiar formation. Thomas notices something different about the crowd's reaction today. Instead of the usual gasps and excited whispers, a reverent hush falls as the horses approach. Perhaps Reverend Hayes has spoken with the tour operators, explaining the importance of respectful observation. The horses take their positions before the church, maintaining their silent vigil as people file past them into the sanctuary. Thomas remains outside longer than usual, watching their calm presence amid the bustle of visitors. After a few minutes, he follows the congregation inside for the service. Halfway through Reverend Hayes's sermon, a commotion at the back of the church draws Thomas's attention. A man has collapsed in the aisle, clutching his chest. Dr. Sarah Wilson, who happens to be attending the service, rushes to his side, calling for someone to dial 911. The victim is a tourist, part of the Faith Journeys group. As paramedics arrive and carefully move him onto a stretcher, Thomas steps outside to ensure the emergency vehicles don't disturb the horses. To his surprise, Thunder has broken formation and now stands at the foot of the church. Steps, head raised, nostrils flared. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asks softly. Approaching the stallion, Thunder paws the ground, once then turns his gaze toward the church doors. Just as the paramedics emerge with the stretcher, the horse takes several steps forward, stopping only when a paramedic raises hand in caution. "Keep that animal back," the man calls. But Thomas notices something odd. Thunder isn't focused on the emergency workers or their patient. His attention is fixed on someone else entirely. Thomas follows the horse's gaze to find Johnny Sullivan standing frozen at the edge of the crowd, his face ashen. Before Thomas can call out, Johnny collapses, falling to his knees on the church lawn. Thomas rushes to the younger man, reaching him just as Dr. Wilson does. "Can't breathe." Johnny gasps, clutching his chest. In a mirror of the first victim's symptoms, pressure. Within minutes, a second ambulance arrives as Johnny is loaded inside. Thomas finds Grace at his side, her face tight with worry. "I'm going with him," she says, climbing into the ambulance despite the paramedics' protest about non-family members. "I am his family," Grace states firmly, "and he's all I have left." As the ambulance speeds away, Thomas notices Thunder has returned to his position in the formation. The other horses stand perfectly still, as though nothing unusual has occurred. Yet Thomas can't shake the feeling that Thunder's behavior was no coincidence. Later that afternoon, Thomas visits Meadow Creek General Hospital, where both Johnny and the tourist, a man named Peter Forrester from Ohio, have been admitted. He finds Grace in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "How is he?" Thomas asks, sitting beside her. "Stable?" "They're calling. It's stress-induced cardiomyopathy, a sudden weakening of the heart muscle. She manages a fragile smile, the doctor says, with proper medication and rest he should recover fully. That's wonderful news. Grace nods, then lowers her voice. Thomas, there's something strange about all this. The other man, Mr. Forrester, had the exact same symptoms at almost the exact same time. That is odd. Thomas agrees, some sort of environmental trigger. Perhaps the doctors tested for that carbon monoxide allergens. Everything they could think of, nothing. Grace's expression grows troubled. But there's more. Johnny told me he felt perfectly fine until Thunder looked at him. He said it was like the horse could see something inside him that he couldn't. Thomas recalls Thunder's unusual behavior, his focused attention on Johnny like Ash, with Elias's heart attack. Yes, Grace whispers. Like the horses somehow know. The hospital room door opens and Dr. Sarah Wilson emerges, looking exhausted but satisfied. Mrs. Sullivan, your grandson is asking for you and Mr. Whitaker. Mr. Forrester would like to speak with you if you don't mind. Thomas is surprised by the request but follows Dr. Wilson to another room, where Peter Forrester sits propped up in bed, color returning to his face. Mr. Whitaker. Forrester says, extending his hand. I owe you an apology. An apology. We've only just met. Forrester smiles weakly. I came to Meadow Creek as a skeptic. I write for a website called Mythbusters Monthly. We investigate so-called supernatural phenomena and expose the truth behind them. He gestures to a notebook on the bedside table. I was here to debunk the miracle horses story. Thomas feels a flicker of indignation but keeps his expression neutral. I see, but then something happened that I can't explain. Forrest's voice drops. When I started feeling chest pains in the church, I had a clear thought. The horses know. It made no sense yet when the paramedics wheeled me out. That black stallion was staring right at me like he could see through me. He shakes his head in bewilderment. The doctors say I have a minor heart arrhythmia. I never knew about. Could have become serious if left untreated. Thomas considers this information carefully. So the horses, I don't know what they are or how they do. What they do, Forrester interrupts, but I know what I felt. There's something special happening in Meadow Creek. Something beyond ordinary explanation. He picks up his notebook. I won't be writing that debunking article after all. News of the dual medical incidents spreads quickly through town. By evening, a new theory has taken hold, that the Sunday horses not only honor Harold Sullivan's promise, but somehow carry on his protective spirit. Watching over the community he once saved, Mayor Collins visits the hospital that night, bringing flowers for Johnny and a copy of Grace's book for Peter Forrester, inscribed with a personal message from the author. Thomas encounters him in the hallway afterward. How's the campaign going? Thomas asks, knowing Collins faces a challenging re-election bid against a younger opponent who has criticized his obsession with horse superstitions. The mayor shrugs. Polls show us neck and neck. My opponent calls the Sullivan Memorial a waste of taxpayer money. Says we should focus on infrastructure and economic development. A wry smile crosses his face, as though the thousands of tourists who visit the memorial each year don't contribute to our economy. What will you do if you lose focus on the historic site full-time? Collins answers without hesitation. Some commitments transcend political office. The following Sunday, Johnny remains in the hospital but has improved enough that Grace feels comfortable attending church. The service passes without incident, though Thomas notices Thunder paying particular attention to an elderly woman. In the front pew after the final prayer, Thomas approaches her gently. Excuse me, ma'am. Have you been feeling all right today? She looks startled by the question. Why? No. I've had this nagging headache since yesterday. How did you know? Thomas glances toward the church entrance where Thunder stands. Just a hunch you might want to mention it to Dr. Wilson before you leave. The woman follows his gaze to the horse, then back to Thomas, understanding dawning. In her eyes, you think that horse. She stops, reconsidering. I'll speak with the doctor. Thank you, later. Thomas learns the woman, Helen Parker, the church organist, was diagnosed with dangerously high blood pressure, requiring immediate treatment. The incident solidifies the growing belief in the horse's unusual perceptiveness as October gives way to November. The first snow dusts Meadow Creek's hills. Johnny recovers enough to return home, though Grace insists he stay at Sullivan Ranch rather than go back to Louisville. His cardiac specialist recommends quiet living and stress reduction prescriptions. The peaceful ranch environment perfectly provides one evening. Thomas visits them, bringing a casserole prepared by Rebecca Hayes he finds. Johnny on the porch wrapped in a blanket despite the cold, watching the horses graze in the distance. "How are you feeling?" Thomas asks, settling into a rocking chair beside him. "Better every day." Johnny's gaze remains fixed on the horses. "I've been thinking about staying in Meadow Creek, permanently taking over the ranch operations. Maybe expanding the sanctuary. Your grandmother would like that." Johnny nods. "The corporate life in Louisville never really suited me anyway." He turns to Thomas. "What thunder did somehow knowing I had a heart condition? It changed something in me, made me reevaluate what matters inside." They find Grace in the kitchen with Ellie Montgomery, reviewing veterinary records for each horse. "How's the memorial project coming along?" Thomas asks, having heard about Grace's latest initiative. "Almost ready." Grace answers, eyes bright. "More transcendent, the truth remains the same. These horses embody faithfulness in its purest form." Johnny joins him, offering a glass of lemonade. A Grand's resting doctor says she needs to take more afternoon naps. Thomas accepts the drink gratefully. "She works too hard for someone her age." Try telling her that. Johnny chuckles, then grows serious. "Thomas, there's something I've been meaning to ask you. The day Thunder alerted us to your heart attack, did you feel something special between you and him, some kind of connection?" Thomas considers the question carefully. "I felt recognized," he says finally, as though he saw something in me that went beyond the surface. "Not just that I was ill, but that I mattered." He sips his lemonade, gathering his thoughts. "Harold once told your grandmother that horses remember kindness. Maybe that's what these horses do. They remember the kindness in people, and they respond to it." As autumn returns to Meadow Creek, painting the hills in brilliant color once more, the town prepares for the 6th anniversary of the whore's first appearance at St. Matthew's. What began as a mysterious ritual has evolved into a community celebration, with a small festival planned for the weekend. Thomas, now fully recovered, though permanently relocated to Sullivan Ranch, helps Grace prepare for the influx of visitors together. They've created a display of Harold's personal items, his journal, the special tack he designed for rescues, photographs of the original horses, who braved floodwaters to save 23 lives. "Do you ever wonder how long they'll continue?" Thomas asks one evening as they sit on the porch watching fireflies dance above the meadow. "The horses, I mean their Sunday journeys." Grace considers this, her fingers continuing their rhythmic knitting motion. "Harold would say they'll continue as long as they're needed. As long as there are people who need reminding of what faithfulness looks like." "And what do you say?" A gentle smile crosses her face. "I say some promises find ways to renew themselves through generations. These horses aren't just honoring Harold's memory. They're teaching all of us how to live with purpose in the fading light." 11 silhouettes move across the distant hillside, returning from their evening patrol of the valley. Their steady, measured pace speaks of vigilance, of promises honored, of devotion that transcends ordinary understanding. Thomas watches them until darkness obscures their forms, feeling profound gratitude for the mystery that brought him to this place in the world where commitments are so easily broken. 11 wild horses have demonstrated the transformative power of promises, kept reminding an entire community that faithful hearts create legacies that endure long after they're gone, as stars appear above the Kentucky hills. Thomas thinks of Harold Sullivan, the man whose extraordinary bond with his horses created ripples that continue to expand through time. Some would call it coincidence, others supernatural, but Thomas now understands it as something both simpler and more profound: love, expressing itself across generations, faithful companions carrying forward a sacred trust. 11 wild horses embodying the truth that broke everyone's heart, and then somehow made it whole again. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.